We're now on Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis, and we have a suffix of Rabbi Yochanan. L'Rabbanan huchpol vonasa. According to the Rabbanan, who say that we bring an isaron with a half a kometz of levona accompanying the morning chavitim, and another half a kometz of levona in the afternoon, is huchpala levonasa? Should he bring a whole kometz of levana with a whole isaron of flour, and another whole kometz in the afternoon? In other words, now that we've established that according to Chachamim against Yossi Abba, that you need a levona in the morning and a levona in the afternoon, should we bring a whole kometz of levona in the morning and another whole kometz in the afternoon? Oh, lo. Or maybe you should only bring half a kometz of levon in the morning and a half a kometz of levon in the afternoon. That's the way we understood it until now. And this has nothing to do with Abba Yossi, because according to Abba Yossi, the amount of levona should never be doubled, because we never found two kmotzim of levona that accompany any particular mincha offering. Mi Amrina, and this is Rabbi Yochanan's analysis. Should we say mitoksha huchpalos also, since we double the amount of flour, and that means that we need an isara, a full isara in the morning and a full isara in the afternoon, is huchpal of honah. So we should also likewise have a full kometz in the morning and a full kometz in the afternoon. O dilma, my de goli goli, my de lo goli, that which the Torah explicitly said and revealed to us, that is what we derive. But that which was not revealed, and the Torah never said that we should double up the levona, and therefore we're not going to double up the levona, even though the Torah told us to double up the soles, the flour, but nevertheless it doesn't say anything about the levona. And now we go on and we talk about the shemen, right? Every minchas machvas has to be accompanied by shemen, and the question is, in the case of minchas chavitim, is we have to ask the following question: how much shemen do we need in the case where we doubled the solas? Right? We doubled the solas to a full isaron in the morning, full isaron in the afternoon, because we didn't have a replacement Kohen Gadol. And now should we double the amount of shemen? Normally, if the Kohen Gadol was alive and he brings an isaron of soles, he would bring 3 lugim of shemen, a half, right? Half a lug with a half visaron of soles in the morning, and another half a lug with another half visaron in the afternoon. What do we do in the case where there's no Kohen Gadol? Should we say that since the amount of soles is doubled, as we discussed before, you need a shlema, and that means a full isaron. So let's also double the amount of oil, and the volume of oil will now be 3 lugim instead of 1.5 lugim. One second. Check one thing here about Abba Yossi. Abba Yossi said that you need 2 kmotzim of levona, right? A kometz shachris kos bein abayim. So certainly, as far as shemen is concerned, this is a very valid suffix here. Omer of tashmach hamisha kmotzim hen. So now we have a Mishnah at the end of Masechta Menachos, Adaf Kuf Daled, and it says that there are 5 kmotzim. And the Mishnah lists 5 instances where the measure of kometz will apply, and the levona of the Kohen Gadol's Minchas Chavitim does not appear on the list? And apparently the answer is because we only mention when there's a full kometz of Levona, and in this case where there's no Kohen Gadol, it's not going to be a full kometz of Levona. So we're going according to the Rabbanon, who hold that a Kohen Gadol bringing his chavitim is only accompanied by half of a kometz of Levona. And therefore, according to the Rabbanon, the Levona of the Minchas Chavit of the Kohen Gadol is omitted from the count of Chamisha Kmotzim because we're dealing with, according to the Rabbanon of Abba Yossi, only a half a kometz of Levona. V'im Isa. Now, if you're going to argue that in the case where there's no Kohen Gadol, according to the Rabbanon, the Minchas Chavitim now has to be accompanied by a full kometz of Levana, is in the Nishkachas Le Shiva. Why does it say here Chamisha? You have to say Shiva. Why? Because in a case where there's no Kohen Gadol, and you have to bring a full Isaron of Soles for each of the two Chavitim offering of morning and evening, and yet only a half a kometz of Levana will accompany the Chavitin offering. And the Gemara rejects this. The Elo Katani, right? If the Mishnah didn't teach us that Kmotzim will occur in unusual cases, if the Kohen Gadol died and it hasn't been replaced, the omission of the Kmotzim in Levona doesn't prove anything. You can't prove that only a half a kometz was offered, because maybe the Mishnah doesn't even talk about these unusual cases. Yosef Rav Kamalei Lashmaita and Omar Le Rav Yossi Rav Shmaya Rav Papa. What are you talking about? Maila kometz bachutz, right? Here's the most unusual case. He went outside of the Azara and he set up his own mizbeach and he was mala a kometz. And it's not mentioned at all in the Mishnah. So we see that the Tana only includes those kmotzim. Oh no, I'm sorry. Mala kometz bachutz is mentioned in the Mishnah, even though it's what? It's an unusual case. So therefore, if it's true that the whole kometz would accompany the chavitim in a case where there's no Kohen Gadol, it should have been listed. It wasn't listed. It indicates that even though the solus is doubled, the levona remains the same. And we don't double it. My Havilov, it's the final conclusion of Rav Nachman, Tashma, Tisanya Kohen Gadol Shemeis V'lo Mini Achet Tachtov, Shlema Shachar, Shlema Arbayim. We're talking about the Isaron. The Isaron of Solus is a full Isaron in the morning and another full Isaron in the afternoon. Umafresh Lo Shnei Kmotzim. And now we're going to see explicitly in the Brisa that we're quoting now that you need to separate two Kmotzim Levona. Kometz Shachris for Kometz Bein Arbayim. And that's going to add the final answer to the question that we asked before. Rabbanan huchpol levonaso. Umafshel shlosha lugim. Oh, but as far as the shemen is concerned, it's only the same shloshas lugim umechza shachs lugim mechza bein arba'im. So we have here the Brisa explicitly komet shachris and komet bein harbayim. And now Rav Nachbar Yitzchak is going to reject it. Mani, if you're going to say that this Brisa reflects the sheet of the Rabbanon, and therefore we come to the conclusion that you have to double the levona, even though the shemen is not doubled. Is ma'ishna levonos for ma'ishna shimna delo. Why is it that you double the levona but you don't double the shemen? Right? You double the fine flour of the solus, and you have a fully started in the morning, a fully started in the afternoon. Now you went ahead and you doubled the levona, and you need a whole kometz in the morning and another whole chametz in the afternoon, shnei kmotzim. So why don't you apply that logic to its conclusion, and therefore the shemen should be a full 3 lugim in the morning and a full 3 lugim in the afternoon. Ella, you're going to have no choice but to assume that this brisa is attributed to whom? To Abba Yossi, who says the Omer Chaviti Kohen Gadol Bialma Shnei Kmotzim Boy. That in general, forget about a Kohen Gadol that died. Just an ordinary Minchas Chavitim, the Kohen Gadol, always requires 2 kmotzim of Levona, and therefore Levona lo huchpala, right? The amount of Levona remains constant, and it's always going to be Shnei kmotzim, so it doesn't matter whether or not the Kohen Gadol is alive or not alive. It's always going to be Shnei Kmotzim. So therefore, Levona lo huchpala, we don't double it over in the case of the Kohen Gadol that died. V'shemen lo huchpal, and that's why we're not going to double the shemen, because we're being very consistent. We don't double the Levona, we don't double the shemen. Umi the shemen li'abi Yosef Yosef lo huchpala, Levonos v'shamna l'Rabbana nami lo huchpala. Okay, so this has to be understood. The Gemara now is jumping from Abba Yossi to the Rabbanon, and deriving the conclusion that everybody agrees that we only, double the soles, but we don't double the Levona or the Shemen. Rav Yochanan halacha ke Abba Yossi ben Dosai. Why? That the Kohen Gadol, even when he's alive, he brings a whole kometz of Levana with the morning chavitin and another whole kometz of Levana with the afternoon chavitin. Umi Omer Rav Yochanan hachi, is this indeed what Rav Yochanan holds? Vaha Omer Rav Yochanan halacha ke stam mishnah utnan, and we have a stam mishnah that says chamisha kmotzim hen. And now, if you're going to hold like Abba Yossi ben Dostoi, well, you don't list the kometz of the Levona that has to accompany the Chavita. The Mishnah does, therefore, must reflect the sheet of the Chachamim. And the Gemara answers, Amoroi niu aliba de Rabbi Yochanan. There's machlokas of Amoroim as to what Rabbi Yochanan actually said. That Amoroi quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying that the halacha follows Abba Yossi. He disagrees with that Amora who quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying that the halacha always follows a stam. Mishnah Hadron Olecha Hatchile. So now we start the 5th parak of Menachos. Kol ha-Menachos bos matzah, with the exception of 2 Menachos that come chametz, but all other Menachos are brought as matzah, and we don't allow them to be machmitz, except chutz mi-chametz shebetoda, the lachmei toda that accompany the korban toda are chametz, and the shtel lechem of the special mitzvah of Chag HaTzeres of Shavuos also is 2 lechamim that are chametz, shem bos chametz. Now the Gemara has a problem, because halacha is that the amount of flour that makes up a mincha has to be precise. But on the other hand, if you're going to use chametz in those 2 cases that we mentioned, so you need a machametz. In common English, a machametz is called sourdough. In other words, the dough that's already been fermented, is already leavened, and you add it to the dough, and it speeds up the fermentation process, leavening process. Now, with regard to the Toda and the Shtel Lechem, you're baking chametz. So now you have a problem, because you're going to have to bring a dover hamachametz, meaning sourdough, from the outside and mix it with the flour of the mincha in order to speed up the process of leavening. Well, then you won't have the precise measure that you need, which is going to be an isaron. Okay, so the question is, why is there no option of kneading the dough without the Dovra Mechametz? By the way, we already learned on Daf Tesam and Beis that the amount of flour is it has to be the exact measure, no more and no less. Now, there's a whole discussion here in the Achronim as to why it's impossible to just simply knead the dough on its own without the sourdough. And he quotes the Tiferes Yisrael, which is very problematic here, but I'll quote it anyway, that a mincha must be kneaded with a K, kneaded in a kli sharis. And it's got to be done in the Kodesh. Now, if you put the mincha into a kli sharis, which you have to do, then it has kedushas haguf. And if you leave it overnight, because it's going to take about 24 hours until finally the dough ferments, then it's going to be possible midin lina. So we have to somehow speed up the process of fermentation so it doesn't have to stay overnight because there'll be a psul of lina. And that's based on the fact that he was mekadesh the dough in a klishares, and therefore it has kedusha guf, and it'll be subject to the psul of lina. And to solve that problem and speed up the process, we have to add sourdough, the mechametz. But now we have a problem. So how do we solve this problem? How do we get the exact measurement and at the same time add the sourdough? So Rabbi Meir has one approach, and Rabbi Yehuda rejects it. Rabbi Meir says, "Hasior bodel lahen mitochan umechamtzon." According to Rabbi Meir, you have the exact amount of flour. You take out a small piece of the flour, mix it with water, knead it, and then let it become leavened, and that's going to be the CR. But it's bodel lahem mitochan. In other words, you had the exact amount of flour, and from that flour you will get the davar machamitz, and then you put the davar machamitz back into the flour. So you always remain with the exact measurement of flour. And Rabbi Yehuda rejects it. Af hi eina min muvchar. This is not the way we should prepare a mincha. This is not the choice way of fulfilling the mitzvah, because you took out a portion of the flour, and it's not going to ferment properly in such a short time. And therefore, if you're going to use this sourdough, so to speak, in order to achieve a leavening power, it's not going to really have that power, because you're at a very short time scale. Ella, but rather, says Rabbi Yehuda, he has an alternative solution to this problem. Maybe es hasior. He takes sour bread. Again, maybe means from his own house. No snow lisoch hamida. Right, he puts it into, and now we're talking about a vessel that's not sanctified. Just 1 second, let me just see if I'm right about that. Okay, whether it's a cliche or not, we'll have to think about that. But it's not relevant to us now. But nosel hamida, they put it in this measuring vessel. Memalias hamida, fill up the measuring vessel with the solas, with the flour, and now the dough will become fully leavened, and the total will not exceed the requisite measure. So again, what Rabbi Yehuda rejects is not taking the CR from outside and trying to ferment it, because it's not going to be fully fermented, and therefore when you put it back into the soles, it's not going to really be mechametz as it should be. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda proposes that you take out this small piece of sourdough, in a separate kli, and then you fill up the measuring vessel with the flour, and even the dough will not be fully leavened, but yet the total will not exceed the requisite measure. In contrast to Reb Meir's method, where the sourdough, the separated portion, might not become leavened properly, this method uses sourdough that is already fermented to the full extent. That's what he calls mevias asior. In other words, he only adds the sior from the outside into the midah. And the Chacham say, Amrulo, af hi hoisach aser yisera. In other words, even though we accept your method, and you think, therefore, that by using a method it will be exactly the required measurement, that's not so. It's always going to be either chasera or yisera, deficient or excessive. Why? Because the sourdough does not take up the same volume as its constituent flour, and it's going to distort the measure. In other words, if you use a bit of sourdough as part of the saron, it's going to result in a situation where the mincha contains either a smaller or a larger volume than required. The saron required for mincha refers to the volume of flour that must be used. Adding a piece of sourdough before the saron is measured distorts this measurement. If the sourdough originally contained just a little water, the sourdough will actually be denser, have a smaller volume than its original volume of dry flour, and thus filling the measuring vessel on top of it will result in a somewhat more than an isarn of flour. If, on the other hand, a larger amount of water was used, the sourdough will take up more space, and the original volume of flour will be a measurement short of a true, precise isaron. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, maintains that the requirement for the isaron does not refer to the measure of flour, but to the actual contents of the measuring vessel at the time that the measurement is made. Hence, there is no question of the sourdough distorting the measurement, because whatever the isaron vessel holds will be the proper amount. And then we get to the Gemara. Boy minei Rabbi Preda mirav asi minayin l'chol menachos shein bos matzah. What is the source in the Torah? So the Gemara says, Minolan, what are you asking such a question? Ksiv ba, lo ksiv ba, lo ksiv ba. Right? In other words, whenever the Torah requires that it be matzah, the Torah will tell you that it requires to be matzah. So, for example, the Torah mentions matzah explicitly in the case of some menachos. For example, the baked mincha, the minchas machvas, and therefore, obviously, they're required to be from matzah. The lo ksiv ba, a mincha where the Torah does not require matzah, it doesn't mention a word about matzah. Ksiv ba. The other menachos, like the minchas marcheshes, it's clear that they too must be matzah, for such is required by the psukim cited next, which deal with all types of menachos, and that we're going to see in Mirz Hashem tomorrow on Daf Nun Gimel. And the Gemara is going to start with Zos Torah HaMincha. All right, we'll see that in Mirz tomorrow. So again, let me wish you a Freilich and Purim, and